Hi, I'm Danny Lee, Royal Air Force veteran, and your guide to keeping your aerospace management system cleared for audit. In today's episode, we're looking at aerospace quality systems and why ISO 9001 isn't enough. There's a familiar moment that happens in a lot of businesses, and this is when the conversation turns to aerospace requirements. Someone leans back, folds their arms a little and says something like, "We're already ISO 9001, so we should be fine." And it's usually said with confidence, sometimes relief. But mostly, it's said because ISO 9001 feels like a safe foundation, and it is, but it's just not in the way that people tend to assume. The problem isn't that ISO 9001 is weak. It's that aerospace environments behave very differently to the environments ISO 9001 was originally shaped around. Once you introduce engineering changes, special processes, traceability, multiple suppliers and regulatory oversight, that foundation starts to feel a bit too thin. So let's break this down properly without any of the jargon. ISO 9001 at its heart is about consistency. You describe how your system works, you follow it, you check whether things are working, and then you put fixes in place when they're not working. If you're making office furniture or running a paint shop, the system is more than enough to keep those things stable. But aerospace doesn't want stable. It wants predictable under pressure. It wants reliable when the stakes jump. And it wants control when everything around starts shifting. So let's put this into a manufacturing example under AS9100. Imagine a machine shop producing components that eventually make their way to a flight critical assembly. The machining is internal, but service treatments are outsourced. Drawings change occasionally, customers might tighten some tolerances, and a supplier's lead time might fluctuate. An ISO 9001 system will help the business run efficiently and consistently on most days, but aerospace asks an even harder question. What happens on the days that aren't most days? What happens when the drawing revision changes the morning the batch is due to ship? What happens when the coating house tweaks their processes without formally telling you? What happens when two very similar looking parts end up on the same bench and one gets moved accidentally? ISO 9001 won't necessarily break, but in my experience, it doesn't stop those problems either. Aerospace expects the system to notice the change, control the change, and ensure nothing escapes even when work is under pressure. And that's where the gap between ISO 9001 and the aerospace standards start to widen. For AS9120 storage and distribution, the picture is different but equally challenging. Imagine a distributor holding thousands of parts from multiple manufacturers. Some are shelf life limited, some require traceability back 5 or 6 steps, some are regulated items with specific handling rules. The warehouse runs smoothly on most days, stock in, stock out, documents filed, and ISO 9001 keeps that flow nice and tidy. But aerospace asks, can you prove without hesitation which batch went to which customer? Can you show the exact documentation that travelled with it? And can you demonstrate that no substitution happened even accidentally? And if there was an issue upstream, could you stop those parts reaching the next stage before it becomes a real problem? ISO 9001 sets structure, aerospace demands assurance. So here's the pain point that most organisations tend to run into. They assume the jump from ISO 9001 to aerospace is just about adding some documents, tightening a few controls, maybe introducing a couple of registers, maybe adding a more formal approval loop. But the real challenge isn't paperwork, it's behaviour. 9001 allows quiet gaps because the consequences are usually quite manageable. And aerospace exposes those gaps because the consequences aren't. The system might look fine, it just won't hold under pressure. A realistic scenario that plays out more often than people expect goes something like this. A customer raises a concern about parts not matching the drawing revision. Nothing catastrophic, maybe a minor mismatch on a revision letter or a certificate that doesn't align. Production investigates and discovers the batch was correct, but the paperwork wasn't updated when the revision changed at the last minute. Everything is completely fixable, the parts weren't faulty, and the team worked hard to put everything right. But in aerospace terms, this is a process breakdown. The system allowed the change that wasn't controlled. And the real issue isn't the error, it's the fact that nothing caught it sooner. Under 9001, that may slide by with a make sure you update this document next time. But under AS9100 and 9120, this becomes a non-conformity that reveals a deeper system weakness. And that's why ISO 9001 simply isn't enough on its own. The common response when organisations notice gaps like this is to throw more documents at the problem. More forms, more signatures, more statements of intent, more instructions written just in case. And this usually makes the system look stronger while quietly making it harder to use. Complexity doesn't equal control. It often masks a lack of control. The better approach, the aerospace approach, is to understand where your real points of vulnerability are. not theoretically, but practically. Where does the system rely on individuals? Where does it depend on memory rather than processes? Where does work continue even when the paperwork isn't perfect? Where do assumptions replace checks? Once you start answering those questions, honestly, the gaps between 9001 and aerospace become obvious and fixable. And so here's the takeaway I'd encourage you to act on now. Look at one of your processes, anyone, and ask, if something changed unexpectedly tomorrow, would our system catch it before it reached the customer? And if the answer is yes, you're already building an aerospace mindset. And if the answer is I hope so, then you found the gap between ISO 9001 and a true aerospace quality system. And that gap is exactly where aerospace standards live. Thank you for listening. Next time, we'll look at why the phrase "we're already certified" causes so many problems in aerospace and how that confidence can quietly unravel under audit conditions. See you next time on Cleared for Audit.